My name is Richard Koyama. I'm from Portland, Oregon, but my parents used to live in Seattle here. We still have a family house here in Seattle. I am one of 4 siblings in my parents' family, and just as a bit of coverage for internment anyway, my parents were interned first at Tule Lake, and then moved about a year afterwards to Minidoka. My family was actually interned in Tule Lake together with at least one set of grandparents and numerous siblings of my parents, all at the same place. So my cousins were there as well in Tule Lake. And while at Tule Lake and Minidoka, actually, my father actually worked. He was able to leave the camp and work locally, and I'm not sure of the details of how that worked out. But at the end of the war, my parents elected to stay in the United States. And by the way, my father was a Japanese citizen, and so I'm not really sure if he was subject to the 2 questions, you know, the no-nos and the yes-yeses. So I never got into any detailed discussions of that issue with him, so I really can't say. But I have the feeling that he was moved to, he and his family was moved to Minidoka because he had no intentions of going back to Japan. Whereas my grandparents, my cousins, and all of my father and mother's siblings elected to go back to Japan after the war. So that's really, in a nutshell, the story of our internment at Tule Lake in Minidoka. My father was actually a car mechanic in White River Valley, and my parents lived in a little crook in the road which joined Auburn and Renton. In fact, the road is still there, and I bet you the crook in the road is still there as well. And I was born in Auburn, Washington. At least I was born in a hospital in Auburn, Washington. My mother was pregnant when we were interned with my brother. So my brother was born in camp. So he would have been born in September of 1942, I think. So we were already in camp by that time. My mother was a homemaker in Auburn, and just as a point of historical perspective, my father worked for a man named Mizuno, and he had a garage on that crook of that road there. Mizuno Garage, and probably the pioneers will still remember that place, although most of the pioneers are gone, I would say. Going back further, my grandfather on my mother's side was a farmer in Yakima, and so as I was telling you earlier, he made several trips across the Pacific and always to come back to Yakima to do his farming. And evidently it was economically more feasible to do that than to do farming in Japan. So I don't know the details of that part of the story. My father made the dresser drawer, this 6-drawer dresser, and the back panel of that drawer has the address of their location in Minidoka. I believe that could have been made. I think it was probably made in Minidoka, but it could have been made from the crate that housed their possessions in shipment from Tule Lake to Minidoka. That's why it's got that address on there. Yeah, there's a card table, 3x3 card table, and a smaller tray, which were made by my grandfather. My grandfather made those definitely in Tule Lake because he never moved from Tule Lake. But obviously he was interested in woodwork, although like I say, he was a farmer. But he liked to do woodwork, and I liked to do woodwork. Perhaps I inherited some of his genes from that perspective. But I don't know the story stories about where and how he got these materials, because obviously materials like that would be hard to come by in a place like Tule Lake. But I also know that he did other things with his hands. For example, he had a stump. It was a hollowed out stump, sawed off at the top. You know, it was mostly burl. But from the stories I heard from my parents and my mother, the stump was something that that he simply did with his hands. I mean, he might have done some carving on it, but mostly all he did was rub it. And so this piece of burl stump was a highly polished piece of stump. Now, unfortunately, that piece of work is in California with my brother, my younger brother, who was born in camp. So I wouldn't be able to show that, but that could have been another piece that we could have had for the show. So, since camp, they've all come, well, from camp back to Seattle. My parents moved back to Seattle sometime in 1945, and we lived for a year with my second cousins. And then we moved to Washington Street for probably about 10 years, at least 10 years. This was right near Washington Junior High School. And then at that point, my parents bought a house on Lake Washington Boulevard. So I'm well aware of the fact that these pieces were with us during all of those moves. So these pieces have been in our family for all of those years. Well, my mother died a few years ago, so effectively the siblings acquired these pieces. And, you know, we fondly say that we jointly own all these pieces. But, in fact, these pieces are still rattling around in my mother's house, which we still retain. And unfortunately, none of the siblings have carted them away and put them up in display pieces, although some of the other things, some of the other artifacts have scattered to our respective homes. But these pieces, you know, we'll probably eventually take them to our individual homes somewhere, but we don't know yet where. I've always known what their origins were. And, you know, camp for us was, I was probably 3 or 4 years old when I first went to camp. And I knew about these things as originating in camp, but, you know, my parents really never talked about camp as a piece of experience in their lives. It obviously was a piece of experience in their lives, but not something that they talked about. Well, mostly I think the dresser drawers obviously aren't just strictly utilitarian. I'm sure that everybody needed a place to store their things in a camp barracks. My grandfather, on the other hand, probably was an artist at heart, and so he liked doing things with his hands, and that's what those represent, because we have a number of those trays. There are probably at least half a dozen of those trays that exist. There's only one table that we know about, but there are a number of trays which are scattered about. And, you know, it makes me wonder where he got the materials, because they're all appropriate for what he was doing. So, but it's interesting to note that there were a lot of craftsmen in these camps, many not probably professional artists or anything, just people who like to do things with their hands. And that's how they spent a lot of their time, I imagine. Yeah, it's certainly a good idea to show them. And I was very glad to hear that the Seattle JCC was going to do this, because we have some pieces in Seattle for that purpose. So I suspect that most people have bad memories of being in camp, but they also have to have good memories of being in camp. It's probably not the best of their times, but on the other hand, it was a piece of their life, and there's no way to give it away or take it back, you know. So that's part of their life. That's just something that they had to live with. I've been to Tule Lake. I went there with my daughter and wife 1 year. And actually, my daughter's been there again, and we still have yet to make the one to Minidoka, but we plan to do so sometime, but not this year again. We're always busy in June. So, well, the reason I offer my impressions here is because I'm the oldest in the family. I do have a younger sister living in Seattle still, but she has no experience in the camp because she wasn't there. She was born after our parents moved back to Seattle. So, but we thank you for the opportunity to show these pieces in your show.